Walter Greene still woke up at 5:45 every morning. Not because he needed to. At 80 years old, there was nowhere left he had to be. No office. No appointments. No wife waiting downstairs with coffee already brewing. But after 53 years of marriage and a lifetime of routine, his body no longer understood the difference between purpose and habit. The old farmhouse creaked softly as Walter sat up in bed, rubbing the stiffness from his hands. Outside his bedroom window, the Vermont morning was still dark, the sky painted in deep shades of blue and gray. Snow rested quietly across the fields behind the house, untouched except for the narrow trail leading to the mailbox near the road. Walter looked toward the empty side of the bed beside him. Still untouched. Still perfectly neat. 7 years. 7 years since Margaret died, and he still couldn't bring himself to sleep on her side. "Morning, Maggie," he whispered. The words came naturally now. Like breathing. Like prayer. Walter slowly stood, pulling his thick wool cardigan over his shoulders before making his way downstairs. The house greeted him with familiar silence. Not peaceful silence. Lonely silence. The kind that reminded a man exactly how empty a home could become after losing the person who filled it. In the kitchen, Walter prepared breakfast the same way he always had. 2 plates. 2 cups. 2 forks. Halfway through cracking eggs into the pan, he paused, stared at the second plate for a long moment, then quietly placed it back into the cabinet. "You'd think I'd learn by now," he murmured to himself. But he never did. Or maybe he didn't want to. The radio near the sink played softly while coffee brewed. Some young news anchor talked about politics, rising grocery prices, and celebrities Walter had never heard of. The world kept changing faster than he could understand it. Margaret used to explain things to him. Now the world just sounded noisy. Walter carried his coffee to the small wooden table near the window and sat down carefully. Across from him sat Margaret's chair. Empty. Still. But somehow occupied. His eyes drifted toward the small framed photo beside the salt shaker. Margaret at 32 years old. Laughing. Wind blowing through her dark hair during a beach trip they took back in 1974. Walter smiled faintly. "You remember that motel?" he asked the photograph quietly. "The one with the broken shower?" He chuckled softly to himself. "Worst vacation we ever had." For a brief moment, he could almost hear her laugh again. Almost. Then the silence returned. Heavy. Unforgiving. Walter looked away quickly and took another sip of coffee. At exactly 6:30 a.m., he stood from the table and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room. The desk was old oak, worn smooth from decades of use. Margaret bought it for him on their 10th anniversary when he first started writing letters during his overnight trucking routes. Back then, the letters were practical. "Miss you. Be home Friday. Don't forget to pay the electric bill." But after Margaret died, the letters changed. Now they were everything he no longer had the courage to say out loud. Walter opened the top drawer carefully and removed a fresh envelope along with a sheet of cream-colored paper. Then he sat. His trembling hands steadied slightly as he uncapped his pen, and he began writing. "Dear Margaret, it snowed again last night. Asterisk, you always loved the first snow of January. Said it made the whole world look forgiven. Asterisk. Asterisk, I tried making your soup recipe yesterday, but I burned the onions again. Don't laugh. Asterisk. Asterisk, the house feels colder lately. I know the heater's working fine, but it still feels colder without you here. Asterisk. Asterisk, I saw Emily's Christmas card this morning. No phone call again this year. Just the card. Asterisk. I tell myself she's busy. Asterisk, truth is, I think people stop knowing what to do with grief after a while. At first they bring casseroles and flowers. Then eventually they just expect you to move on. Asterisk. But I don't know how to move on from someone who was half my life. Sometimes I still reach for your side of the bed in the middle of the night. Sometimes I still hear your footsteps upstairs. Asterisk, and sometimes I'm afraid the sound of your voice is starting to fade. Asterisk. Walter paused. His jaw tightened slightly. That part always hurt the most. Not death. Not loneliness. Forgetting. The terrifying realization that one day he might no longer remember exactly how Margaret sounded when she laughed. Walter removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. Then he finished the letter. Asterisk, anyway. I'll write again tomorrow like always. Asterisk. Love you forever. Walter. He folded the paper carefully, sliding it into the envelope with practiced hands. No address. No stamp. Just her name written across the front. Margaret Greene. Walter stood slowly and grabbed his coat from the hook near the door. The cold air hit him immediately as he stepped outside. Snow crunched beneath his boots while he made the familiar walk toward the mailbox near the road. Most people in town knew about the letters. Some pitied him. Others avoided the subject entirely. A few quietly called him crazy. Walter didn't care anymore. Because the truth was simple. Writing to Margaret was the only time during the day he still felt connected to something alive inside himself. At the mailbox, he opened the lid gently. For a second, he hesitated. Like always. As if some small part of him still believed she might answer someday. Then he slid the envelope inside. The metal lid closed with a soft clang. And that was it. Another letter sent nowhere. Walter stood there longer than usual that morning. The wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the property. In the distance, a dog barked somewhere down the road. Life continued. Without asking permission from Grief, Walter turned to walk back toward the house when something caught his eye. Inside the mailbox, he frowned. There was another envelope sitting at the bottom. He froze. Slowly, Walter reached inside and picked it up. No stamp. No return address. Just his name written neatly across the front. Walter Greene. His heartbeat quickened unexpectedly. For a moment, he simply stared at it, confused. The paper trembled slightly in his weathered hands. Then, slowly, he opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. Short, simple, but enough to stop the entire world around him. Dear Walter, I think Margaret would want you to know that she still listens, and I think she would be very proud that you never stopped loving her. Please write again tomorrow. Walter's breath caught. The snowy road blurred in front of him. His hands began shaking harder now. Not from age, from emotion. He read the note again, then again, and before he realized it, tears rolled quietly down his face. Because for the first time in 7 long years, someone had answered him. Walter Greene didn't sleep that night. The letter sat on the kitchen table beside his untouched cup of tea while the old farmhouse groaned quietly around him. Every few minutes, he picked the note up again, rereading the same lines like they might disappear if he looked away too long. Please write again tomorrow. The handwriting was delicate, careful, almost old-fashioned. Not Margaret's, but somehow warm. Walter rubbed his thumb gently across the paper. Who would do something like this? And why? Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows while the grandfather clock in the hallway crept toward midnight. Walter sat alone in the dim kitchen light wearing the same cardigan from earlier, unable to pull himself away from the note. For the first time in years, the silence inside the house felt different. Not gone, but interrupted. And that scared him almost as much as it comforted him. Because grief had become predictable. Loneliness had structure. But hope? Hope was dangerous. Hope made old men believe impossible things. At 2:13 a.m., Walter finally stood and walked upstairs. Before climbing into bed, he paused beside Margaret's framed photograph on the dresser. You got something to do with this? He whispered softly. The photograph smiled back in frozen silence. Walter exhaled through his nose. Yeah, he murmured. I know. Crazy thought. Still, before turning off the lamp, he placed the mysterious letter carefully beneath Margaret's picture frame, like it belonged there. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Walter was already awake before sunrise. Waiting. Not that he would admit that to himself. He made coffee too strong, burned the toast slightly, and checked the mailbox twice before 6 a.m., even though he always waited until 6:30. By the third time he looked out the window, he muttered under his breath, You're acting like a teenager. But at exactly 6:30, he sat at his desk again. The blank paper waited patiently in front of him. Walter stared at it longer than usual, then slowly began writing. Dear Margaret. Well, somebody wrote back. I suppose you already know that. I spent half the night trying to figure out who would bother answering an old fool writing letters to his dead wife. Maybe it's some teenager playing a prank. Maybe someone feels sorry for me. Or maybe, he paused, shook his head slightly, then continued. Asterisk no. Never mind, asterisk. Truth is, I didn't realize how badly I needed to hear someone say those words. The house hasn't felt this quiet in a long time. Asterisk funny, isn't it? One small letter, and suddenly everything sounds different. Asterisk. I even opened the curtains this morning. You would have liked that. Walter stopped writing and looked toward the frosted kitchen window. For the first time in weeks, sunlight pushed faintly through the clouds. Tiny streaks of gold stretched across the snow-covered yard. Margaret always loved winter mornings. Walter smiled faintly before finishing the letter. Anyway, whoever wrote back asked me to write again today, so I guess I will. Love always. Walter. This time, when he walked to the mailbox, his heartbeat felt strangely nervous, like he was approaching a first date instead of an old metal box by the road. Walter slid the envelope inside carefully, then hesitated. Slowly, he opened the mailbox again. Empty. Of course. He almost laughed at himself. What exactly were you expecting? He muttered. But as he turned back toward the house, he noticed tire tracks near the road. Fresh. Someone had stopped here recently. Walter frowned slightly. The Greene farmhouse sat far outside town. Hardly anyone drove past unless they had a reason. His eyes lingered on the tracks for a long moment before he finally walked back inside. 3 towns over, Claire Dawson sat in the corner of a small cafe, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The blinking cursor mocked her. Still empty. Still nothing. Another refill? Claire looked up. The waitress gave her a sympathetic smile while holding the coffee pot. Claire nodded tiredly. Please. The woman poured quietly before walking away. Claire rubbed both hands over her face and leaned back in the booth. 28 years old. Award-winning journalist by 30. Featured in magazines. National stories. Big city career. And somehow, completely falling apart. 3 months earlier, Claire had been living in Boston, writing human interest pieces for one of the largest digital media companies in the country. Then came the burnout. The panic attacks. The insomnia. The mornings where getting out of bed felt impossible. Her editor called it creative exhaustion. Her therapist called it severe depression. Claire called it emptiness. After one humiliating breakdown during a live interview, she packed her bags and disappeared to Vermont, renting a tiny cabin outside the town of Bellwood under the excuse of taking time to reset. But the truth was uglier. She didn't know who she was anymore without work. And without noise. Her own thoughts became unbearable. Claire glanced toward the folded letter sitting beside her laptop. Walter's letter. The first one she had accidentally found 2 days earlier while driving through town. She still didn't fully understand why she answered it. Maybe because the loneliness inside those words felt familiar. Maybe because the grief sounded honest in a world where everyone online pretended to be fine. Or maybe because some broken part of her needed to believe people could still love each other that deeply. The cafe door opened suddenly, letting in a burst of cold wind. Claire barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on Walter's shaky handwriting. I don't know how to move on from someone who was half my life. Something about that sentence haunted her, because Claire knew exactly what it felt like to lose part of yourself. Even if the thing she lost wasn't a person. It was purpose, meaning, direction. She closed the letter slowly, then reached for her notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote, "The man who writes to his dead wife." A story idea. That's all it was supposed to be. A small local piece about grief and loneliness in rural America. But the more Claire thought about Walter sitting alone in that old farmhouse every morning, the less it felt like journalism, and the more it felt personal. That evening, Claire drove past the Greene property again. She told herself it was for research. Nothing more. The farmhouse stood quietly beneath the fading orange sky, smoke curling from the chimney. Warm, lonely, alive. Claire parked farther down the road and watched from inside her car. Then she saw him. Walter stepped outside carrying a small bag of trash toward the bins near the barn. His movements were slow but steady, shoulders slightly hunched beneath his heavy coat. He looked smaller in real life. Not weak, just worn, like life had slowly sanded pieces of him away over time. Claire's chest tightened unexpectedly. For a moment, she imagined him inside that house alone every night, talking to photographs just to hear a voice answer back in his mind. She thought about her own apartment back in Boston. The silence there. The nights she cried without understanding why. Maybe loneliness looked different at 80 than it did at 28. But it hurt the same. Walter suddenly stopped walking. Claire froze. Slowly, he turned toward the road. Toward her car. Even from a distance, she could feel him noticing the headlights. For one terrifying second, Claire thought he might walk over. Ask questions. Recognize her handwriting somehow. Instead, Walter simply stared for a moment before turning back toward the house. Claire released a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Then she looked down at the blank envelope sitting in her passenger seat. Tomorrow morning, she would write him again. The letters became a ritual. Every morning at 6:30, Walter Greene sat at the old oak desk near the living room window and wrote to Margaret. And every afternoon, someone wrote back. At first, the replies stayed short, gentle, careful, almost cautious. Dear Walter, I think grief is just love with nowhere left to go. Maybe that's why your letters matter so much. Or, Dear Walter, tell me more about Margaret's garden. You always sound happiest when you write about spring. Walter never asked who the writer was. Not directly. Part of him didn't want the illusion broken, because whoever sat on the other side of those letters somehow understood the exact shape of his loneliness. And after years of silence, that became enough. The farmhouse slowly began changing. Not physically, but emotionally. The curtains stayed open longer. The radio played louder. Walter even started shaving regularly again after nearly a year of neglect. One morning, he found himself humming while making coffee. Halfway through the song, he stopped cold. The sound startled him. I haven't done that in years, he whispered. Across town, Claire Dawson noticed changes too. She slept through the night for the first time in months. The panic attacks became less frequent. The heaviness inside her chest softened slightly. Each morning, she sat down to answer Walter's letters. It scared her how much she looked forward to them. Because this wasn't journalism anymore. Journalists observe people. They didn't become emotionally attached to them. But Claire had stopped feeling like a journalist weeks ago. Now, every time she opened one of Walter's envelopes, she felt like she was listening to someone speak honestly for the first time in her entire life. No filters, no performance, no pretending, just truth. And truth was rare, especially in America, especially online. One snowy Thursday afternoon, Claire sat inside her cabin wrapped in blankets while reading Walter's latest letter near the fireplace. Dear Margaret, the girl writing back asked about your garden today. Asterisk funny thing is, I realized I haven't touched it since you died. Asterisk. The roses probably think I abandoned them. Truth is, I think I abandoned a lot of things after losing you. Maybe even myself. Claire stared at that line for a long moment. Maybe even myself. Something inside her tightened painfully, because she understood that sentence too well. 3 months earlier, she had stood in the bathroom of a Boston hotel, staring at herself in the mirror after her breakdown. Mascara smeared, hands shaking, phone buzzing endlessly with messages from work. And the only thought running through her head had been, I don't recognize this person anymore. Claire closed her eyes, then slowly pulled out fresh paper and began writing back. Dear Walter, I don't think people notice when they slowly disappear from themselves. I think it happens quietly. One disappointment at a time. One lonely dinner at a time. One morning where getting out of bed feels heavier than the day before. But I also think people can return. Slowly. Maybe letter by letter. Claire stopped writing. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. That wasn't meant for Walter. Not entirely. Some part of her had written those words to herself. She folded the paper carefully before driving toward the Greene farmhouse just before sunset. Snow drifted softly across the empty road while old folk music played low through her speakers. For the first time since leaving Boston, Claire didn't feel like she was running anymore. When she reached the mailbox, she noticed something new. Fresh footprints. Walter had clearly checked the box recently. Claire smiled faintly to herself before slipping the envelope inside. But as she turned back toward her car, the farmhouse porch light suddenly flicked on. Claire froze. The front door creaked open. Walter stepped outside wearing his heavy brown coat, one hand resting against the frame for balance. Even from a distance, Claire could see him looking toward the mailbox. Toward her. Her heartbeat immediately quickened. She should leave. Right now? But Walter slowly raised one hand. A small wave. Simple. Friendly. Claire hesitated before lifting her hand back awkwardly. Walter smiled faintly. Then, to her complete surprise, he started walking toward her through the snow. Oh God, Claire whispered. Panic flashed through her chest. What if he recognized her handwriting? What if he asked questions? What if seeing the real person behind the letters ruined everything? Walter approached slowly, careful with each step across the icy ground. Up close, he looked older than she imagined. Deep wrinkles lined his face. His shoulders curved slightly inward from age. But his eyes were kind, warm in a way that immediately made Claire feel guilty. You must be the young woman renting the Miller cabin, Walter said gently. Claire blinked. He didn't know? Of course he didn't know. She swallowed quickly. Yeah? Claire. Walter nodded politely. Walter. I know, she almost said. Instead, she forced a small smile. Nice to meet you. For a moment, neither spoke. Cold wind moved softly through the trees around them. Then Walter glanced toward the mailbox. You're out late, he said. Claire's pulse jumped slightly. I like driving, she answered quickly. Walter nodded like that made perfect sense. My wife used to do the same thing, he said quietly. Said roads helped her think. The mention of Margaret instantly changed something in his expression. Not sadness exactly. More like tenderness wrapped in grief. Claire looked down briefly. She sounds lovely, she said softly. Walter smiled. She was. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable after that. Then Walter surprised her again. You want some coffee? He asked. Claire looked up quickly. What? It's freezing out here, Walter said. And I made too much. A faint chuckle escaped him. I always make too much. Claire's chest tightened unexpectedly at that sentence. Loneliness lived inside those words. Quietly. Permanently. Every instinct told her to say no. Getting closer was dangerous. But another part of her, the exhausted, lonely part, didn't want to get back into the car. So against her better judgment, she nodded. Okay. The farmhouse smelled like cedar wood, old books, and coffee. Warmth wrapped around Claire the moment she stepped inside. Walter carefully took her coat and hung it near the door before leading her into the kitchen. This place is beautiful, Claire said honestly. Walter glanced around. Huh, he murmured. Never noticed. Claire smiled faintly. That made him laugh softly. It was the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him. He poured coffee into two mismatched mugs while Claire noticed small details around the kitchen. Old photographs. Handmade curtains. A crossword puzzle half-finished near the table. And everywhere. Margaret. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the entire house still breathed with her memory. Walter sat carefully across from Claire and slid the mug toward her. So, he said gently, what brings a young journalist all the way out to Bellwood? Claire nearly choked. You know I'm a journalist? Walter shrugged lightly. Small town. People talk. Claire laughed nervously. That dangerous, huh? Walter smiled faintly. Depends who's talking. For the next hour, they spoke about simple things. Weather. Books. Small town life. Nothing important. And yet somehow, it felt important anyway. Several times, Claire caught herself studying Walter while he talked. The way he paused before mentioning Margaret's name. The way loneliness lingered beneath even his happiest memories. The way he smiled like someone who expected joy to disappear quickly. And slowly, the guilt inside her grew heavier. Because Walter trusted her. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. And sitting there across from him, listening to the warmth return to his voice little by little, Claire realized something terrifying. Those letters weren't just saving him anymore. They were saving her too. Winter settled over Bellwood like a long exhale. The snow grew deeper. The nights grew quieter. And somehow, against all logic, Walter Greene no longer dreaded mornings. Because now, every sunrise brought two things. A letter to Margaret, and a reply waiting in return. The routine had become sacred. Walter wrote at the oak desk near the window while the kettle warmed on the stove. Then sometime later, usually near sunset, Claire would drive out to the old mailbox and leave another envelope behind. They never discussed the letters during their visits. Not directly. It was the one invisible line neither of them crossed. Instead, they built something gentler. Something slower. Claire began stopping by the farmhouse twice a week. Then 3 times. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes books from town. Sometimes nothing at all except herself. And Walter always made coffee. Too much coffee. One snowy evening, Claire sat at the kitchen table watching Walter struggle to fix a loose cabinet hinge. You know, she said, smiling faintly. Most people would just buy a new cabinet. Walter snorted softly. Most people waste money. Claire laughed. There it is. What? That old man judgment. Walter pointed his screwdriver at her. You'll understand when you're 80. Claire leaned back in her chair. At this rate, I'll be lucky to survive 30. The joke slipped out too honestly. Walter looked up immediately, really looked at her. And for a brief second, Claire regretted saying it. Because people like Walter noticed pain. The quiet kind. He slowly set the screwdriver down. You want to talk about that? He asked gently. Claire looked away toward the frosted kitchen window. No. Walter nodded once. Not offended. Not pushy. Just understanding. And somehow, that almost made it harder. Because most people demanded explanations. Walter simply made space for silence. Claire swallowed carefully. You ever feel like you built your whole life wrong? She asked suddenly. Walter leaned back against the counter. All the time. Claire gave a small laugh through her nose. I'm serious. So am I. That caught her off guard. Walter walked slowly toward the stove and poured hot water into 2 mugs. I spent 40 years thinking being useful was the same thing as being happy, he said quietly. Turns out those are 2 very different things. Claire stared at him. You regret your life? Walter handed her a mug. No, he said softly. But I regret how little of it I actually stopped to feel. The words lingered heavily between them. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug. I used to think if I worked hard enough, she admitted quietly, eventually I'd feel like enough. Walter nodded slowly like he already understood. But instead, Claire continued, I just got tired. The farmhouse fell silent except for the crackling fire in the next room. Walter studied her carefully for a moment, then asked the question nobody else had bothered asking her in months. When's the last time someone took care of you? Claire blinked. Her throat tightened instantly, because she genuinely didn't know the answer. And suddenly, without warning, tears burned behind her eyes. Claire looked down quickly, embarrassed. I'm sorry, she whispered. Walter frowned softly. For what? I don't know. She laughed shakily. Falling apart in your kitchen, I guess. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said gently, Claire, sometimes people don't fall apart. She looked up. Sometimes, he continued, they just get tired of carrying too much alone. That sentence broke something inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like ice finally cracking after a long winter. Claire turned her face away quickly as tears rolled down her cheeks. And Walter, kind, patient Walter, pretended not to notice immediately. Instead, he simply moved closer and placed an old box of tissues beside her coffee mug. No speeches, no awkward comfort, just kindness. Claire laughed weakly through tears. You always know what to say. Walter smiled faintly. No, Margaret did. The mention of her name softened the room instantly. Claire wiped her eyes carefully. You really loved her, didn't you? Walter looked toward the living room where Margaret's photograph sat near the fireplace, then smiled. With everything I had. Claire felt her chest ache unexpectedly, because very few people talked about love like that anymore. Not sincerely, not without irony. Walter sat down across from her slowly. You know what the strangest part about grief is? He asked. Claire shook her head slightly. You expect to miss the big things, he said quietly. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug absent-mindedly. But that's not what destroys you. Claire listened carefully. It's the tiny things, Walter whispered. The way she used to hum while washing dishes. The sound of her slippers upstairs. The fact that nobody asks if I want cinnamon in my coffee anymore, because she was the only one who remembered. His eyes glistened slightly now. And, eventually, he continued softly. You realize the world keeps moving like none of it mattered except to you. Claire's heart broke listening to him. Because beneath every sentence was the same fear. Being forgotten. Walter looked down at his hands. I think that's why I kept writing the letters, he admitted quietly. Claire froze slightly. The letters. Neither of them ever mentioned them aloud before. Walter smiled sadly. Crazy old habit, huh? Claire forced herself to breathe normally. No, she said softly. Walter looked up, and Claire meant every word when she said, I think it's beautiful. Something vulnerable passed across his face then. Small, fragile, real, and for one dangerous moment, Claire almost confessed everything. The mailbox, the replies, the truth. But then Walter spoke again, and the moment disappeared. You know, he said quietly, those letters probably saved my life. Claire's entire body went still. Walter stared into his coffee while speaking. There was a night last winter, he admitted slowly, before the replies started. His voice faded slightly. Claire felt cold all over. I remember sitting in this kitchen thinking, Walter swallowed hard. Thinking maybe I was done. Her breath caught. I wasn't angry, he continued softly. I wasn't even sad anymore. Just tired. Claire stared at him in horror. Walter smiled faintly. Then somebody wrote back. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too fragile. Walter looked toward the desk near the living room window. And somehow, he whispered, it reminded me I was still here. Claire's eyes filled again instantly. Because suddenly this wasn't harmless anymore. The letters weren't comforting him. They were holding him together. And the guilt inside her became unbearable. Walter noticed her expression immediately. "Hey," he said gently. "What's wrong?" Claire stood abruptly from the table. "I should go." Walter frowned in confusion. "Claire, I just remembered I have work tomorrow." "That storm's getting bad," Walter said, glancing toward the window where snow now fell heavily. "You can stay a while longer." But Claire was already grabbing her coat. Because she couldn't breathe. Not in that room. Not carrying this secret. Walter stood slowly beside the door while she struggled to put her gloves on with trembling hands. "Claire." She looked up. Walter's expression softened immediately. "You all right?" The concern in his voice nearly destroyed her. Because he trusted her completely now. And he had no idea who she really was. Claire forced a weak smile. "Yeah," she lied quietly. Walter studied her for a long moment. Then nodded gently. "Well, drive safe." Claire opened the front door quickly. Cold wind rushed inside. But before stepping out into the snow, she paused. Then turned back toward him. Walter stood beneath the warm kitchen light looking older than usual somehow. More fragile. And suddenly Claire realized something terrifying. If the truth ever came out, she might break his heart all over again. So instead of speaking, Claire simply whispered, "Good night, Walter," and disappeared into the storm. Claire Dawson disappeared for 4 days. No letters. No visits. Nothing. And for Walter Greene, the silence returned faster than he thought possible. The farmhouse felt colder again. The mornings heavier. At exactly 6:30 every day, Walter still sat at the oak desk writing letters to Margaret, but now his hand hesitated between sentences. Because another absence had quietly entered his life. And somehow, that frightened him. On the 4th morning, snow fell softly across Bellwood while Walter stared at an unfinished letter. "Dear Margaret, I think I upset her. Funny how an old man can survive losing the love of his life, but still worry about disappointing one lonely girl. The house feels quiet again. I didn't realize how much noise another person brings into a room until it disappears." Walter stopped writing, then slowly lowered his pen. Something didn't feel right. Not just loneliness. Fear. A deep instinctive fear that Claire wasn't okay. He folded the unfinished letter and stood from the desk with effort, reaching for his coat. For the first time in years, Walter Greene decided not to wait for someone else to come back. Claire sat alone inside her cabin wrapped in blankets while unopened mail piled beside the door. The television played softly in the background, though she wasn't listening. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Walter's voice again. "Those letters probably saved my life." The sentence haunted her, because now the truth felt cruel, manipulative, unforgivable. Claire buried her face into her hands. "What did you do?" she whispered to herself. At first, the letters had been kindness, then comfort, then dependency, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had become emotionally woven into the survival of a grieving old man. A knock at the door startled her violently. Claire froze. Another knock. Slow, gentle. Her chest tightened immediately. She already knew who it was. Slowly, Claire stood and opened the cabin door. Walter stood outside holding a paper grocery bag beneath falling snow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Walter lifted the bag slightly. "You stopped answering your mailbox," he said softly. Claire's throat tightened instantly. Walter looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like the silence had reached him too. "You drove all the way out here?" Claire whispered. Walter shrugged lightly. "You forgot your scarf at the house." Claire looked down. The blue knitted scarf rested folded neatly over his arm. Margaret's scarf. The one Walter had lent her during her last visit. Guilt hit her so hard, she nearly stepped backward. "Walter, you all right?" he asked gently. That question almost broke her immediately, because he still sounded worried about her. Even now, Claire looked away quickly. "You shouldn't be here." Walter frowned slightly. "Why not?" "Because I lied to you. Because I made you believe something impossible. Because I'm becoming the reason you survive." But none of those words came out. Instead, Claire whispered, "I think I made a mistake." Walter was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly like he understood more than she realized. "We all do." Claire shook her head. "No, not like this." Snow drifted softly between them. Walter studied her face carefully. Then his eyes moved slightly past her shoulder, toward the desk inside the cabin, toward the stack of unfinished letters sitting beside her typewriter. Claire's heart stopped, because resting on top of the pile, clearly visible, was one of the envelopes addressed to him. In her handwriting, Walter's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Enough for Claire to feel the entire world shift. His eyes slowly returned to hers. And suddenly, he understood. The silence between them became unbearable. Claire's lips trembled. "Walter, I can explain. You wrote them." The words came out quiet, almost fragile. Not angry. Worse. Heartbroken. Claire felt tears rise immediately. "Yes." Walter stared at her for a long moment that felt endless. All this time, Claire shook her head quickly. "I never meant to hurt you." Walter looked down at the scarf in his hands. "You let me believe," his voice cracked slightly. "You let me believe Margaret somehow." "I know," Claire whispered desperately. "I know." Walter stepped backward slightly. Not from fear, from pain. And somehow that hurt even more. "I didn't do it as a joke," Claire said through tears. "I swear to God I didn't." Walter stayed silent. "You sounded so lonely," she continued. "And I just answered once. That's all it was supposed to be. But it wasn't just once." The truth landed heavily between them. Claire looked down. "No." Walter's eyes glistened now. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed the letters too. Because talking to you was the only thing making me feel alive again. Because somewhere along the way, you became family." But Claire couldn't force the words out. Walter nodded slowly to himself, then gave a small, broken smile. "You know the worst part?" Claire's chest tightened. "I don't even know if I should thank you or hate you." The sentence shattered her completely. Tears streamed down Claire's face openly now. "I'm sorry." Walter looked away toward the falling snow. Old grief moved across his face again. Heavy, ancient, familiar. For the first time since meeting Claire, he looked truly alone. And Claire realized with horror that she had brought the loneliness back. Walter carefully placed the grocery bag beside the door, then gently held out Margaret's scarf. Claire took it with shaking hands. "I never wanted to replace her," she whispered. Walter nodded faintly. "I know, but knowing didn't fix it. Nothing fixed grief that easily." Walter turned slowly toward his truck, then stopped. Without facing her, he asked quietly, "Were any of the letters real?" Claire broke instantly. "Yes." Walter closed his eyes briefly. Because deep down, that was the answer he feared most. If the letters had all been fake, he could dismiss them, forget them. But they weren't fake. Every word carried real loneliness, real compassion, real connection, and that made losing them hurt even more. Walter climbed into the truck without another word. Claire stood frozen in the doorway while the engine started beneath the storm. Then slowly, Walter drove away. That night, the farmhouse felt emptier than it had the day Margaret died. Walter sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of letters spread around him. Months of conversations, memories, hope. He picked up one carefully. "Dear Walter, I think people survive because sometimes strangers choose to care about each other." Walter stared at the handwriting through blurry eyes. Claire's handwriting, not Margaret's. Claire's. The truth should have destroyed the comfort inside those words. But somehow, it didn't, because the kindness had still been real. Walter rubbed one trembling hand across his face. Then his eyes drifted toward the living room bookshelf, toward a small, unopened envelope resting behind Margaret's photograph. His breathing slowed. The final letter, the one Margaret wrote before cancer took her voice completely. Walter had never opened it. Couldn't. Some griefs felt too sacred to survive explanation. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, he reached for it. Slowly, carefully, and with trembling hands. Walter opened the envelope.